Good morning and welcome again to the Professor and the CEO. With me, Ben Gillam, CEO of ThirdWay. Just to quickly remind you again while we're doing this series is I have this great privilege of being a CEO and a business owner in a wonderful company in London doing wonderful projects. And I've learned throughout the 10 years through all the mistakes I've made, the best thing I can do is speak to experts in the field to help guide me along the way. And particularly in this type of crisis where there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of unknown, to actually lean on people and to lean on experts, like Rachel is about to introduce herself as well, has been invaluable to me. And we just thought it'd be an excellent opportunity to bring to some of you the conversations we have about things we think are important and to share them into the business community and hope they're of great value and use to you. So that's from me.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Doern and I'm a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London. And my research relates to entrepreneurship in times of crisis. So I look at crisis management and resilience and as these things affect entrepreneurs and their businesses. So crisis management really deals with some of the topics we're going to be discussing today. It's about thinking and reflecting on your own vulnerabilities within your organizations and how you can better prepare or plan for a crisis. Crisis management is also about moving further on how to contain or limit and localize the effects of a crisis, but also how to recover, which is a topic that we're going to discuss next week. So what kinds of responses or strategies can you utilize to bring your business back to normal or to a new kind of normal? And also what can you learn from a crisis? So what kinds of factors affected your performance and how can you feed that learning back into that process, that cycle of events? And I also looked at resilience, which is something that we talked about in episode 3. And resilience is about one's ability or a business's ability to bounce back from adversity, to maintain a stable equilibrium throughout. And it's also about the kinds of resources, assets, and strengths that an organization has to help it weather through difficult times. So that's me in a nutshell. And I think I'd like to kick off today's session, which again is about detecting vulnerabilities and crisis planning and preparedness by just saying a few words about why it is the case that not all businesses do in fact engage in crisis planning. So crisis planning is really about thinking through a crisis before it occurs. So thinking about if a crisis does impact on our businesses, or what can we do, or what precautionary steps can we take? What kinds of exercises can we run within the organization? What procedures can we put into place? Can we create a crisis management team, and so on and so forth? So it's not something that all businesses do. It usually falls within the domain of larger businesses, or what's been referred to as high reliability organizations. So any kind of organization really in which the potential for risks and harm are great for individuals. So think nuclear power plants, aircraft carriers, all those big organizations, but other large organizations as well. And in contrast, smaller businesses are less likely to engage in crisis planning. And there are some SMEs that do so, and there are advantages to doing so. And I'm going to speak today as to what some of those advantages are. But a lot of them don't, very small businesses in particular, don't engage in crisis planning because they don't necessarily have the resources to do so, because small businesses tend to firefight, right? So they're more they tend to react to things as opposed to being proactive. So for many different reasons, but I want to emphasize and stress that the impact of a crisis on a small business can be particularly profound. And that's why a small business should engage in such planning as well, because it has limited resources and reserves. But also because it's less likely than its larger counterparts to spread the risks and costs of a crisis over a big customer base, over many product or service lines. But also, and importantly, because for people like Ben, for the CEOs, for the owner managers, for the entrepreneurs, the impact of a crisis can profoundly impact on them, because all of their energies, all of their motivations, all of their resources have been wrapped up in these businesses over time. So it does make sense and is important for all businesses to participate in crisis planning. And there's a lot of good evidence and research to suggest that those small businesses who do engage in this kind of planning are more likely to prevent a business interruption from occurring or to shorten its length, but also to reduce the likelihood that they have to rely on external resources. And we see that's important, especially during the pandemic, right? Because even with all these large and generous stimulus packages around the world, that some businesses are in fact slipping through the cracks. So with this in mind, one thing that we wanted to try today, well, we're going to do two things. We always do a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please Please include those questions in your Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, but also we want to do some polls to assess your experience of some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So let's go to our first vote. So you should see on your screen now the first question, which is, does my company have plans in place to manage the current crisis, the pandemic? And you can select one of those three responses: yes, no, and don't know. So, okay, so that's good news, and not entirely surprising at this juncture in the crisis. You would hope that businesses are taking time to be transparent about their plans and to share those plans with their staff. So that's really great news. And if you're the person responsible for such, then congratulations. So I think that's fantastic. So let's take away that result and let's actually go to the second vote now. So the second vote will show up on your screen. So you can see, does my company have plans in place to manage other potential crises? So we know with the pandemic that a lot of other things will be going on as well, either as an offshoot of the pandemic or in relation to such, like an economic crisis or recession. But also there are other things coming up, possibly things that haven't currently been anticipated, or those things that have been, like Brexit. So as far as you're aware, does your company have plans in place to manage other kinds of potential crises over the next years? Is this something that you actively discuss within your organization? Yes, no, don't know. Okay, so here you can see the results on your screen. So a little bit more divided. So a few people saying yes, and other people saying they don't know. Okay, so thank you very much for that, for engaging in that poll. And now I'd like to turn to Ben and to ask Ben a little bit about what crisis planning means to him, and if it's something he or
I've got to say, before this crisis, I would have thought that our crisis planning was quite good. And the reason for that was I was a child of the last recession. Like I sort of cut my teeth in industry in 2008, 2009, saw how bad it was. So having gone through a crisis, I thought I'd really built a robust business to deal with a crisis. What I came to realize very quickly, what we had done was keep loads of retained profit and really healthy cash flow in the business to help us get through a crisis. But we hadn't actually really forecast or planned for any particular type of crisis. It was more, we've got a slush fund for a rainy day. And so whilst that wasn't bad, what I can see now retrospectively is, okay, we might not have planned really robustly for a global pandemic, but we could look at the most likely scenarios to hit us and impact us as a business and know how we would deploy ourselves to deal with them. And the reality is one of those outcomes probably wouldn't have been that different to what we've had to do now. I think where we've been fortunate is, although we are sort of at the upper end of an SME now, that's sort of 250 people, £100 million of revenue, we still feel quite nimble, or at least we think nimble. It does take a little bit longer to turn the ship than it used to, but we've got that sort of mindset that's sort of very much there from our startup mentality, as you sort of touched on, sort of roll up your sleeves and make it happen. So we've been able to deploy internal resource really quickly, and we've been able to go to the right external people and fill in the gaps really quickly. But unquestionably, we could have been maybe 4 or 5 weeks ahead of the game if we had done some sort of scenario planning beforehand. And definitely in the future, it's something we would do.
Great, thank you. And that's exactly, I think, what I want to sort of touch upon next about, this notion of thinking in advance and perhaps looking for some of the warning signs of a crisis, because even with the pandemic, there are very few crises for which there are no warning signs whatsoever. And although it's easy for us to say that now, to step back and say, oh, there were signs of this encroaching pandemic. So hindsight is 2020 and all of that. There is something to that. But as an aside, crises are difficult to predict, and they're often defined as low probability, unexpected, more likely to be unpredictable or difficult to predict events that do have serious consequences for business. They impact on their bottom lines. They create decision-making time pressures and ambiguity. They can damage the public image of a company. They can threaten its goals, all of these things. So it is important to plan for those reasons, albeit difficult. And if we think about the pandemic in particular, one of the warning signs of such that we can all look out for is signs of a significant, rapid, and difficult to contain emerging external disruption. So I think that captures the pandemic quite well. And yes, it was difficult to know exactly when and how the COVID-19 crisis would unfold. But it wasn't impossible, was it, necessarily for us to put into place, either at the government level or even at the business level for some companies, to imagine what those scenarios might look like and what impacts there could be on businesses. Because if we step back, right, we can remember, if we think back to the news, that there were signs of this occurring as early as December of 2019. So that's when the coronavirus was said to come out of, or believed to be originated from, Wuhan in China. And then later the WHO in January went in and they declared it to be a public health emergency of international concern. And then China closed its doors and put a clamp down on, or banned public transportation, closed non-essential business services. And then there were instances of quarantining and testing and so on. So we saw that happen, but that was happening over there. So I think a lot of people didn't imagine it could happen to us necessarily. And then it spread, and it spread so quickly, and the severity was high, but also because of those things, but also because the WHO was concerned about the inaction by governments over the next several weeks, that it was only on March 11th that it declared the situation to be a global pandemic. And then just before then, Italy, which was badly affected, went into lockdown. The UK went into lockdown, as we all know, on March 23rd. And the States and other places went into lockdown thereafter. So there were some signs, and I'm sure it'll be discussed and debated for years as to if we have recognized any of those signs in advance. So signs of a significant, rapid, and difficult to contain emerging external situation. I think that's really important. And perhaps closer to home, signs of distress in your supply chain or industry. That's something else that really people, entrepreneurs, companies should be looking out for. So, and distress might include a sudden change in communications with key stakeholders like suppliers, distributors, clients, but also a sudden change in behavior. So have people stopped paying their invoices, or has the timing of payments or the amount of payments changed in any way? Has there been a loss of a key customer or client? Have there been diminished revenues? So these are all signs, warning signs that something is going down, something is going wrong. And when I spoke to people like Ben over the last few weeks about were there any signs of this crisis emerging, a lot of people did tell me that before the lockdown, that there were indications that their customers and otherwise were struggling a little bit. So Ben, I don't know if you wanted to mention any warning signs.
I was wonderfully naive about how quickly this could become a pandemic that would have a major impact on just the way we lived our lives. Thankfully, my CFO, I think I've mentioned before, because he was very happy when he got a shout out on our webinar, did see it. He saw it very early, and so planned very much from a financial point of view. It was really interesting listening to you describe crisis there and talking about the pandemic. And I was taking a step back and thinking it would be hard to necessarily to do that scenario for us, like the size of business we are, but we could definitely foresee the impact. We could definitely have forecasted the impact of something like it. And looking back to when sort of the gravity of it all first hit, what we were able to very quickly across all of our service lines was say, okay, what is the impact? What's the upstream impact? What are our clients likely to go through? And what's the supply chain going to go through? And even more granular than that, sort of self-employed subcontractors of the supply chain, what are they going to experience? Because the pressure in that sort of natural food chain of an industry just gets felt at different times. I think for us, what we were able to model very quickly is a significant amount of our client base really make their core money, or their day-by-day money, is through management fees by having assets under management. So we can look at that client base and say, okay, well, they're relatively financially secure, certainly in terms of fees coming into their organizations for the next 20 months. So we were able to sort of actually communicate with them quite calmly and ascertain, their ability to sort of fulfill their contracts and fulfill their invoicing. So that side of things wasn't too hard. We were actually more concerned with the supply chain, because where our clients might be able to look at things on a 2 to 3 year view, we can probably look at things on a 12-month view. The supply chain probably only sees sort of a 3-month horizon, and then the work for them are probably month by month. So we spend as much time thinking about actually how we manage that supply chain, because that falls over when there's a recovery. If we can't actually have a mobilized supply chain, that inhibits us anyway. So we sort of really modeled out those scenarios, and we got there quickly. As I say, there wasn't a single thing that's happened that we couldn't have planned for beforehand. Like, it's unquestionably that's the case. I just feel we were lucky that as a management team, we're very hands-on, that we understood those things really well. We didn't have to be educated. I think in terms of warning signs, I probably feel like the end of this month is going to sort of be the big warning sign for sort of like the real estate world in which we operate and serve as a whole. The June quarter they come in, sort of, with rent demands going to be there for clients, being probably their second biggest overhead after staff. I think this is when we start to see how businesses are really starting to struggle, and how many have fallen between the cracks, as you say, and whether they've got the support they need to actually meet their commitments. But also, sorry, I'm going on a bit now, but we do have a concern that the government schemes have been fantastic. We're businesses haven't tapped into any of them as yet, other than the furlough scheme. But it doesn't fundamentally help a business if they don't have a plan for how they're going to pay it back, or how they're going to manage themselves throughout the economic crisis. All it can do is just prolong the pain. And an observation I've definitely got from a lot of companies speaking to is they've been really grateful for being able to tap into this support, but they've not used that then as a buffer or as a period of grace for crisis management now. Even say, okay, we're delayed, but we've got something to do. In fact, I feel it's almost, if they're not careful, they're going to compound their challenge by almost taking their foot off the gas or relaxing, thinking, okay, we've got a few months. My experience of economic crisis is you have to be more proactive than ever before. You have to be on the front foot like never before. You have to be more innovative than ever before. Sitting back and waiting, unless you're a particular type of business, really, really won't help in a crisis.
Absolutely, exactly. So that's what I want to discuss next. So what are some of the steps that businesses can take, small businesses in particular, to better prepare for a crisis? And I think one of the first things people like yourself, companies like yours can do really comes from, or is part of the title of today's session. It's really about detecting and addressing vulnerabilities. So there is a view that whether an event manifests as a crisis, an external event even manifests as a crisis internally within your organization, depends on your own vulnerability. So a lot of things are happening out there, but we also know that for some businesses, even throughout this pandemic, some of those businesses have been thriving, doing well. So it all depends on things that are going on within your business, but how you're set up as well, what your focus is, how those businesses are positioned. So we know that for a lot of companies, it had to do with their sector, their product or service line, how well they were already established in the online sphere and otherwise. But there are some signs within a small business, for instance, that if these factors are present within your business, that it could signal an impending crisis. So let me give you some examples. So an incompetent management team. So this can be highly problematic. So are the people within your organization, especially those in lead roles, are they skilled enough? Are they experienced? Are they educated? Do they have the abilities to be in those roles to create a direction for your business? That could be a warning sign. Incompetent management. Also conflicting targets. So do people within the management team agree upon where the business is at and where it needs to go? Or is there agreement between the management team and the board of directors, let's say? And if there's not, then that could be highly problematic. Deficiencies in accounting and operating systems, also problematic and something that should be addressed. And we discussed last week about the importance of being agile and flexible within one's own systems and processes internally within the organization. And I think the opposite is problematic. So if there are too rigid systems and processes, which makes it difficult for you to change, to adapt to a crisis, then that's also a signal. and a shortage of cash or poor attitudes to customers. These are all potential problems or vulnerabilities in organizations. And with the current pandemic, people have also been telling me that being deficient in ICT or e-commerce knowledge and experience also created further setbacks for them, made it difficult for them to address or adjust rather. So deficiencies in resources, strengths, or assets, and identifying those gaps and building those things over time. So Ben, in this regard, would you say that
I think for me, I always believe this, like businesses reflect their leadership teams. And fundamentally in a small business, that probably means they reflect their founder and their CEO. So, being completely honest, like every deficiency I see in the business, I tend to see in my own character. And, in fairness, every strength I see in the business, I see a little bit of myself in there as well. So, sort of a mutual benefit and burden there. But I think that the key thing is that if you're doing well as a business, you're going to create certain deficiencies. Certain managers are fantastic managing 10 people. They've got to manage 30 people. That might not be their bag, but you only find that out through success. So I think there's sort of got to be a natural mindset within the business that we are going to come across deficiencies. We are going to come across pinch points. Our own successes might create new risks in their turn. The problem is when you hide from those new risks. The problem is when you've actually discovered that someone might need upskilling, or actually they might have moved into a role that doesn't suit their skill set, that's not in their sweet spot. It's not dealing with it, it's kicking the can down the road. And I would say that was certainly one of my biggest failings was deficiencies I saw in the good times. It'd be naive to believe that those deficiencies will correct themselves in the challenging times. We had to dive in and quickly deal with them. The good news was for us, we didn't have to identify them. We sort of knew what they were. But one of the key things that we did well, and I would say it's probably saved my sanity and saved my mental health, which is still unquestionably taken a battering during this time, is within the leadership team, we did the division of labor. The people who were excellent operationally, dealt with everything operationally, protected me from a lot of day-to-day challenges that I've just not had to be involved in. And likewise, myself and a business partner, we've gone the other way and said, right, we're going to be in front for market-looking piece, really focusing there. And I think the other thing to remember is, what I've talked on this series already about the inherent loneliness of being a CEO, being a leader. It's like you can think, we've got these things we need to deal with. Every business is the same. And actually, one of the best things you can do, one of the best things I've done, is actually look at my industry and look at my clients and say, what problems are they going to be facing? What deficiencies are they going to have? Not to revel in it or make myself feel better, but to say, I understand my client and what they're going through. We've got a much better chance of giving them the outcome they need and the solutions they need from the products we're creating. It's quite cathartic. It's very, very thought-provoking to actually speak to your clients and on a peer-to-peer level say, what are you guys going through? What are you experiencing? What are the challenges you have? And bundle all that energy into problem solving there. And then what you're doing is actually you're pushing your business into the future whilst you're dealing with it in a present crisis.
Okay, great. And with all of that in mind, I'd like to go to our third poll now. So if we could go to our third vote, and that should appear on your screens now. Who is responsible in your organization for crisis management? So if you could make your selection, is it the CEO and top management? Is it a crisis management team? Is it everyone? Is it no one? So if you can make your selections, and then we'll see the results in just a moment. So let's see the results if they're ready. Aha. Okay, so we can see on our screens that that many organizations that are represented here in this particular episode of the people attending do seem to have a crisis management team in place, and that's really interesting to note and slightly surprising. And perhaps it I would be interested to know more about whether or not those teams were implemented beforehand or after the crisis. And my guess is a lot of them were implemented after the fact, but we can also see that in a number of cases, the CEO and the top management team have a say in deciding, of course, what's going on and who's, or in terms of them being responsible rather, and everyone, which is great. So no one has said that no one is responsible for crisis management. So I think these are really positive results. Okay, so we can take away those results now. So in terms of what entrepreneurs can do, we've already discussed, and I'm aware of the time, but we've already discussed detecting and addressing vulnerabilities. And I also want to talk a little bit more about a few other strategies that people can implement. So another is creating a no blame culture. A no blame culture. So this is about encouraging people within your organization to report mistakes or to report potential problems. So it's not about telling on other individuals. It's not about people per se. It's about systems and processes and what has gone wrong and what might go wrong. And how you can create this kind of culture is to meet up frequently with your team. You can keep the lines of communication open. And when you're having these meetings, you can discuss not only what those concerns might be, but how you can respond to such and who is responsible for that. So while not all companies have the resources necessarily in place to devise these risk-related exercises or to implement sophisticated crisis plans in advance, or even to prepare crisis management teams, every organization can create this kind of culture. And it's achievable from the outset, from when the business is first created, or even from today, let's say. So I think with this in mind, why don't we go to the fourth vote? So let's put up the fourth vote now, which is there a culture within my organization of reporting potential problems and mistakes? Yes or no? I'll just give you a moment to input your results.
Intrigued by this one. Be really
yes.
Interesting.
And why don't we see those results if they're ready? Okay, so a little bit of variation, but most people say yes, which I think is really encouraging as well. But there are these kinds of cultures that are being created, and for those who suggested no, I think something for your organizations to work towards, and something that is highly achievable. So thank you very much for that. We can take away those results. So detecting and addressing vulnerabilities, that's one thing. Creating a no-blame culture, that's another thing that entrepreneurs can do. And thirdly, developing an anticipation mindset. And I think Ben alluded to this. So research has shown that often concerns about a crisis are driven by the actual occurrence of a crisis, which makes sense, doesn't it? So we didn't think that much about pandemics and how they could impact on our personal lives or our professional lives until we were actually in one. But this is true for other kinds of crises as well. So when I was studying the London riots a number of years ago, in August of 2011, even that particular crisis, which spanned for 4 days in London, affected 22 of the 32 boroughs in the city, even on day 4, even after all the media coverage, some people who were affected on that day, whose businesses were burnt down, who were vandalized, who were looted, even some of those individuals thought, this won't happen to me. This won't happen to my business. This won't happen in my neighborhood. So I think that's important, that a lot of people fail to prepare for a crisis because they don't anticipate such. So developing this kind of anticipation mindset is important. And I think it goes hand in hand with creating a no-blame culture. So this involves creating a kind of vigilance to potential problems and challenges, not only within the internal environment, but also the external environment at the same time. So it's about what my mother used to always say. So always think about what can go right here and what can go wrong here. So this is about continually challenging within your organization things that seem to be working and developing a sense of wariness for stability, routine, and complacency. So in the latter case, prior research suggests that this can be achieved through job rotation and through retraining, among other things. So making sure that people within your organization have an opportunity to work within their roles and to develop competencies and do those roles effectively, but then to move on and to get a fresh pair of eyes in those existing roles and to support new people in those roles. So Ben, I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments in relation to either of those things.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think I think it goes back when you're a particularly small business and a growing business, going back to that sort of almost the cult of the owner piece. It's really brave to look at your vulnerabilities in any aspect of life. That's brave, but particularly as a business, there's always a reason, always an excuse to think about something else or to cancel a meeting like that, to do a new client meeting. I think that's the mistake that I've definitely made and businesses can make. It's like you have to dedicate time to do that and just be brutally honest with yourself, because if you don't, the brutal truth will eventually catch up with you. But I think it's really interesting what you said there about training and job rotation, so on and so forth, because I can sort of objectively see the theory of it and why it would work, but practically executing it, like, it feels so challenging. Again, so there's always something to do. So to have people doing training, to have people out of the office, to have people away from the day job, you sort of grow as a group as well. You get that human dynamic working really strongly, and to sort of roll that out, to roll a fresh set of eyes in, feels so challenging. So I think it's something I'm coming out of today that I'm going to spend more time looking into, because they are real tools for making the organisation more resilient. That's sort of fascinating, and everyone benefits from that. So it's got to be worth looking into.
Great, thank you. And finally, building on prior experiences of adversity. So this is also something that organizations can do. And in my earlier research on crises, I found that entrepreneurs who had previous experiences of adversity, whether that be in their businesses, in their workplace, in a professional capacity. So maybe their businesses were affected by a natural disaster like flooding. So there's lots of flooding in the UK, or by an external shock like the global financial crisis, or a fire, or they were victims of burglary, or even in their own personal lives. So they have been diagnosed with a disease or experienced the loss of a loved one, all of these things, that those individuals were more likely to take precautionary steps, to act quickly into maintaining a sense of quiet confidence that they would be able to recover. So I think this is another thing that entrepreneurs can actually benefit from, reflecting on these experiences and what got them through and what might help them move forward. And I just want to turn very quickly to a couple of our questions. And the first question from the viewers, thank you for these. The first question is, there are different times of crisis, and how can you be prepared for every eventuality? And it's a great question. And of course, it's very difficult to do so. And we're even hearing reports now of insurers not covering people for the pandemic because it wasn't labeled as a potential crisis. And that's, some people are seeking legal advice over such as a result. So, but what you can do, I think, is you can do a lot of the things that we've been discussing. So you can think about what's going on within the organization, and are we prepared? Where are our deficiencies? You can think about developing this no blame culture and this anticipation mindset. And again, to help carry you through, you can reflect on those situations that have enabled you to weather through difficult times. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Ben, about how can you prepare for every eventuality?
So as we've talked today, what's really dawned on me is, of course, I can't foresee every eventuality, but I can foresee most of the impacts that any eventuality could have on the business. So it doesn't need to be as granular as, are we going to have another global pandemic? It's a case of, if all of a sudden, like, revenue stops by X percent, what's the impact on the business? What's the impact on the supply chain? So I think it's about actually looking at the root of the problem, not like the fruit of the cause. And it's something I'm definitely going to take away from this crisis.
And another quick question just for you, Ben. Ben, how do you see setting up yourself to be crisis ready for the next unexpected crisis? You mentioned scenario planning. Who should be involved in that, in the design and build industry?
So yeah, it's a good question, and I wouldn't say it's a question I've got the perfect answer to yet. I think what we did well as a business was always have the slush fund. What we didn't do well was invest some of that slush fund into scenario planning. And part of that is also knowing, do you have the right people in the right seats and the right skill sets to deal with that crisis? So I think it's about actually, and we're already doing this, it's taking stock and saying, what have we done well? What haven't we done well? And speaking to people like Rachel and seeing, like, this isn't the first crisis that's ever happened. There's loads of data out there, our businesses that do well in crisis and businesses don't, and seeing which ones are most relevant to our industry, and being unashamed in learning from it and borrowing some of their tricks and implementing them into the business.
I agree. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. In our next episode, we're going to talk about recovery, which I think is important, recovering from a crisis. So thank you for joining us, and goodbye from me.
See you soon.